First off, thank you for everyone for coming to our webinar. This is a digital workspace webinar. For those of you that may not be familiar with Altai Systems, we are an association technology solution built within Microsoft Dynamics 365. Without taking more than just a moment, I'll go ahead and sort of say the reasons that most of our clients choose to work with us is to meet their ongoing challenges that their associations face when using technology and with growth in general. One, they recognize for associations to serve their mission, they need to run a successful business, and Microsoft has put billions towards running a business, so why not leverage those technologies to their advantage? And two, they come to Altai specifically because we've built on top of that billion-dollar platform the tools and functionality that are unique to the association space. If you're interested in hearing more about what Altai has to offer, we're here to chat at any point. Additional housekeeping, however, I wanted to let everybody know, if you weren't aware, this is a CAE credit webinar. Even if you don't have your CAE or aren't currently planning to get it, we'll still send you the credit confirmation in a few days so that you have it for your records should you choose to pursue your CAE in the future. Questions for this webinar. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, there's a couple of ways to reach out. The best way, in our opinion, is to go ahead and raise your hand as a participant, and at a good point, we'll give you access to speak and let you ask your question live. Otherwise, if you prefer, you can always put that into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll ask the question for Tom at that point. In fact, as we sort of get started with that, if you haven't found the chat yet, go ahead and look for it. Put who you are, where you're at, and how you feel your association is managing their digital workplace as of right now before we have the presentation. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about was sort of, the digital workplace in general is something that we here at Altai care deeply about. And in fact, the impetus to this webinar is based off of joint clients that we have with Delcor and working on what the digital workplace looks like for our shared clients. And that's really what sort of gave birth to this, was having those conversations and having Tom in the room to have those really unique look at what do you do for your association to make sure that your digital workplace is really clean. So we thought with that in mind and how that work was going, would be a fantastic opportunity to introduce additional clients and others in the association space to what this means and how it works. So without further ado, Tom Jelen is our guest today with Delcor. He has over 20 years of leadership experience in the IT management and digital workplace strategy. He's done digital work product development, project management. Before working at Delcor, Tom was the director of digital communications for the American Speech and Sign Language and Hearing Association in Maryland. And his current role as the senior strategic consultant for Delcor, Tom not only provides digital workplace counseling, but also CIO counseling, and is really their lead for what they're championing from a workplace environment. We're excited to hear from him as we go on today and learn from his expertise. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris, for the introduction, and thank you all for taking the time out of your workday to participate in the webinar. Before I jump in too deep into the presentation, just want to share a little bit about Delcor. We're a technology consulting and services company. We work pretty much exclusively with nonprofits and associations, in addition to providing outsourced IT support for many organizations. As a managed service provider, we offer software selection, outsourced CIO services, like Chris mentioned, technology assessments, and digital workplace consulting, which is what we're going to focus on here today. So I want to start with just a brief story. Way back in April of 2006, Apple's then CEO, Steve Jobs, announced to the Cupertino City Council that he had plans, they had acquired property, and they had plans to build a second campus that they originally referred to as Apple Campus 2. So this idea was conceived with Jobs and Apple's former chief designer, Johnny Ive. And so over 5 years, Johnny Ive worked very closely together with the building architect, Norman Foster. They designed every detail of this new building, from the glass panels down to the elevator buttons. All told, Apple reportedly spent about $5 billion building this new one infinite loop Apple Park campus that looks a little bit like a spaceship to me. And it launched in 2017 to a lot of fanfare, a lot of publicity and so on. However, like many buildings, this building was pretty much empty all of 2020. And despite having an extraordinarily expensive, beautiful, empty building, Apple's annual gross profit for 2020 was $104 billion, which was a 7% increase from 2019. And Apple finished 2020 with its most profitable quarter ever, as sales of its iPhones and iPads and MacBooks soared during the pandemic. And so the question is, how did they do that, right? They had an empty office. And the obvious answer is the same way that we all did, right? We relied on digital tools for communication and collaboration rather than in-person meetings and interaction. And so Apple used a digital workplace rather than a physical workplace to get work done. The good news is that building a successful digital workplace isn't nearly as difficult or expensive as building a brand new headquarters like Apple did, or renovating your physical office space. Today, we're going to define a little bit about what a digital workplace is, talk about the emerging importance of a digital workplace, and then outline some of the challenges that organizations face with their digital workplaces. And then after that, I'm going to share an approach for how you can design a more effective digital workplace for your organization. There should be plenty of time for questions at the end too. We all know what a physical workplace is. It's tangible, right? I'm in one right now. It's the cubicles, the desks, the meeting rooms. It's been around a long time. Some offices kind of have these dystopian cubicles like the one you see here in this image, while many organizations have embraced open offices that are popular in Silicon Valley. No matter the type, the odds are that you've worked in an office at some point in your life. And in a physical office, you can see your colleagues, IRL, in real life. You can meet them in meeting rooms. You can interrupt your colleagues by knocking on their door or stopping by their workspace. Managers can do the proverbial managing by walking around. You can have social gatherings to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries. All in all, offices perform a service for organizations because they bring staff together in close proximity. The digital workplace is a fairly new concept, but all of you are probably very familiar with the tools and platforms that make up many digital workplaces. You may not love it, but email's been around for a long time, right? That's a digital workplace tool. Microsoft has its suite of collaboration tools like SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. Slack is popular at a lot of tech-focused companies. And many organizations have also adopted consumer-oriented products like Dropbox and Google Workspace. No matter what the platform, the odds are that almost every organization that exists these days has some level of a digital workplace. And I didn't invent this term, digital workplace, and to prove it to you, I just want to provide a definition from a venerable consulting firm, Deloitte. I like that they refer to it as the natural evolution of the workplace that helps you get work done today. We almost can't imagine what life was like before all of these tools entered our lives. But the truth is that digital workplaces are fairly new. Inter-office email wasn't really available until the 80s. SharePoint came on the scene a little over 20 years ago. Google Workspace is even newer. It was an outgrowth of consumer products from Google, Gmail, Google Calendar, and Google Drive. The iPhone only entered our lives 15 years ago, and it has changed how we expect instant access to all of the world's information and knowledge. And a couple of years after the iPhone was introduced, the term digital workplace became popularized. And if we fast forward to 2017, just 5 years ago, Microsoft introduced its Teams platform. And obviously, thousands and thousands of other platforms and tools have all been developed during that time period, as there's really been this just huge acceleration in the evolution of our digital workplaces over the past 20 years. With that background kind of out of the way, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the pandemic. I'm sure everyone's a little tired of hearing about it, but it obviously changed the world in many ways. It accelerated some trends that were already occurring in a major way. Just as an example, earlier this year, Q found that 59% of US workers who can work from home were working from home all or most of the time. So obviously, there's a lot of jobs that can't be completed remotely, but the massive remote work experiment we conducted over these past 2 years has really changed work in some fundamental ways. It's now more common for knowledge workers to be working from home than not. So we'll have to see if that tilts back in the coming years, but it's really a pretty remarkable change from just 5 years ago. So now that we've got some context and definitions out of the way, I'd like to hear from all of you about how important your digital workplace is now. And so I think Chris is going to he's brought up the poll here. We'll let everybody take a second to complete that. We'll give everyone a minute to respond, and then we'll share the results.
Looks like we have about 70% of the audience participated at this point. If
All right.
a little bit more, we should be good to go in a moment.
I'm anxiously awaiting the results here.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and, pardon me, end it, and we'll share the results.
All right. So it looks like in general here, we've got a lot of people are saying it's extremely important or very important. 0 people are saying that it's not at all important. And so that's pretty remarkable. I think, not necessarily surprising, but I think it is pretty remarkable. The next thing that we'll do, if you can remove the poll results, Chris, we can compare that just to some industry survey data that I'm going to share here. If we compare that to a survey that was done by Simpler Media earlier this year in 2022, their State of the Digital Workplace report, it was 1,200 digital workplace executives and practitioners. You can see that almost 3/4 of the respondents, very similar to what we just said their digital workplace was extremely or very important. And I think what's notable is that it's a significant increase from before the pandemic in 2019, where it was much, much lower. It just wasn't as top of mind as I think it is these days. So thank you for participating in the poll. While digital workplaces are really important, as we just demonstrated with that poll, that doesn't mean that they don't come without challenges. And so I just want to hear from all of you kind of how well your digital workplace is working for your organization. So Chris, do you want to put up the second poll here? I've got a few options for you to consider, including that you should be leading this webinar, in which case hopefully we'll hear from you towards the end. Give everyone a minute to vote.
Took us a little over 60 seconds to get majority of respondents last time, so I think we'll probably give about the same amount of time for this question.
Sounds good. So it'd be interesting to hear from people kind of where they think they're doing these days in terms of their digital workplace.
All right, that's about 80% of our audience has participated. So I'll go ahead and give that an end and share the results.
All right. So we didn't have anybody saying it's perfect. I should be leading this webinar. I guess that's why you attended this webinar here. And a lot of people saying it's working pretty well, but there's room for improvement where we have a lot of challenges. I'm glad to hear that no one is saying it's a disaster. Please help me. So appreciate you all participating in that poll and just kind of sharing kind of where you are in terms of your own digital workplace evolution. And hopefully for those of you having some challenges, I'll share some ways that you might be able to address those. When I do work with associations, a number of kind of consistent themes related to challenges come up. And some of this may match some of your experience at your own organization. Some people will say, you know, I'm just inundated with email. It may be email or chat messages or whatever. It's just too many things coming in at me. Staff adoption is often a challenge at a lot of associations. There's products that are deployed and people aren't necessarily taking it up and using it. Difficulty finding information, just kind of locating where things are and where they're saved. There's so many places to put things now. Finding stuff can be a challenge. You'll have a lot of organizations that are struggling with what's called shadow IT. Those are just kind of systems that aren't really officially deployed. And they may even be redundant with the official systems that you have in place. Lack of training is almost universal challenge that organizations have, where these systems are changing so rapidly. It can be really hard for staff to keep up and manage the fire hose of new information and training requirements. And then last but not least is standards, right? So you've got different departments using the tools in different ways. It's really hard to work together as an enterprise. So those are kind of common challenges that I see in my work. And I'll just share with you, they asked a similar question about the top 3 digital workplace challenges in that State of the Digital Workplace report. There's a long list of challenges that are listed here. But what I wanted to emphasize was the fact that the limitations of the current platform was not number 1. And in fact, that challenge is actually lessened a little bit since the 3rd quarter of 2020. For the most part, from a technical standpoint, implementing digital workplace platforms is really a matter of subscribing, like choosing a cloud-based service and swiping a credit card. That the technology deployments are almost always cloud-based. But despite the young age of these products, the digital workplace platforms are pretty mature. And so other challenges tend to take precedence: budget, adoption, lack of collaboration, lack of training, digital literacy, disconnected workforce, and so on. And so really the point that I want to make, is, and I say this as a person, I have a computer science degree. I've worked in IT my whole career. I love IT people, but I'm also aware of the limitations of technology for solving problems. If the technology platform isn't the biggest challenge, you may need to kind of broaden your perspective a little bit to find solutions to the digital workplace challenges that you have. One of the visuals that we like to show at Delcor is this iceberg image. I really like this image. Above the surface, if you can imagine this iceberg as a metaphor for your digital workplace, you've got the things that you can see and experience, right? The platforms that you choose, the user interfaces, whether the site loads and performs quickly. However, like an iceberg that potentially is sinking your digital workplace ship, it's often what's below the surface that causes some of the major problems: a lack of governance, documentation, standards, policies, culture, training and collaboration, how you organize your information. All of those things can sink your digital workplace ship, so to speak. And so in my experience, digital workplace success is often contingent on the G word, governance. And so what I want to talk about is how you can approach implementing governance to achieve greater digital workplace success at your organization. In my view, digital workplace governance requires a number of things to be successful. And the first thing is executive sponsorship. You're never going to have success with your digital workplace if you don't have somebody in a position of power who recognizes the importance of the digital workplace for success and who has power to make people listen. IT is obviously an important stakeholder for digital workplace success, but as I mentioned, IT has a unique perspective on technology. It may not be shared by everyone. IT people tend to like new technologies. They get it before your average staff person may. And so to offset that bias, you want to make sure that you're including perspective from outside of IT. So I often encourage clients to bring in some skeptics into the conversation, because without addressing the skeptics' concerns, you may continue to have challenges. Call them whatever you will, but standards, policies, guidelines, you need to have something written down. For almost every organization I've worked for, the digital workplace standards aren't documented anywhere. So new staff are just expected to kind of learn the unspoken rules for communication and collaboration. And so they, spend time asking their colleagues where to find files or how to navigate the folder structure, or they get gently admonished if they're asking a question in the wrong place. And then the process repeats itself when the next new staff person comes on board. And for every new client I've worked with, IT doesn't have sole responsibility and accountability for the entire digital workplace. Oftentimes, there are digital workplace systems that IT has really no involvement in whatsoever. Just as an example, Adobe Creative Cloud might be managed by your marketing or creative team. SurveyMonkey might be managed independently by the research team. And so if staff need help or they need training, staff need to understand who manages what platforms within your digital workplace ecosystem. And then last but not least, you really need to recognize that you're going to need an ongoing commitment to success. This means stakeholders will need to reconvene on a regular basis because your business needs and the platforms are actually going to change over time. So when we think about outcomes that you should be striving for as part of your digital workplace governance initiative, these are a few of the things that I really emphasize. One, staff should be able to store files in specific places with standardization, with structure and naming. Reducing your risk, you should probably discourage personal file storage systems. Staff should use designated collaboration and communication channels to work with colleagues and external stakeholders. And again, there needs to be some sort of enterprise agreement on what tools are used for what purpose. So if you're using Microsoft Teams, maybe you should avoid having real-time chat in a redundant system, like a random Slack channel or a group text message chain. And one of the quickest and easiest wins from governance and standard setting is that staff simply become aware of all the tools that they have available to them. I've worked with organizations that had some redundant systems in place just because staff literally didn't know the capabilities of the platforms that they had already deployed. Whether it's Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace, those platforms are extraordinarily powerful. There's a lot of tools within the tool set that an organization can take advantage of. And then lastly, staff really need to have training on the tools that you've designated for your organization. So that's those are the elements, I think, of success. That's what you're striving to get to. In order to get there, the process that I typically take clients through is we start by understanding where you are now. So we want to survey staff to get a handle on their perception of the existing digital workplace systems that you have in place. Many digital workplace platforms like Microsoft 365 also have some usage data. So you can actually look at some quantitative data in terms of how staff are actually using the systems that you already have in place. And what that does is it establishes a baseline that you can measure against in the future. The next thing is that you want to create a cross-functional steering team, like I mentioned before, that's made up of stakeholders from outside of IT and IT that can develop your governance framework. And I always suggest that a steering team works best when they're working out loud and they're sharing what they're doing with colleagues along the way. As I emphasize, the steering team needs to have some level of executive sponsorship to ensure that whatever they come up with has a really good chance of being approved by senior leadership. And the team should basically work through a series of meetings to develop a digital workplace roadmap or governance plan. And I'll touch on what that consists of in a minute, but that really is focused on the pain points and standards that you need within your organization. And after you have a governance plan, you're going to need to implement changes most likely. Unless you have things perfect, you're probably going to need to change things. So for example, maybe you want to retire a redundant shadow IT system, or you may need to reorganize your file structure to make it easier for staff to understand. So you'll probably need to plan for that. And then you'll lastly just need some level of training, almost guaranteed, based on the platforms that you've designated to be part of your digital workplace. And I'll touch on that in more detail here in a minute. So the digital workplace roadmap at Delcor, we talk about the following elements that are pieces of the digital workplace roadmap. And I'll spend some time here just kind of explaining each element in a little bit more detail. The first thing is digital workplace strategy. And oftentimes people get kind of intimidated when I use the word strategy. Your experience of strategy may have been a long, 2-year strategic planning process. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm a really big proponent of developing a very simple digital workplace strategy, or any digital strategy, 1 or 2 pages. But I think it is important to clarify, what are you trying to accomplish with all these digital workplace tools? In my view, there's 3 things that you need to address. What are your objectives? Is it, collaborate with external stakeholders? Is it allow our staff to work remotely? You need to have some idea of what you're trying to accomplish. And then measurement. How are you going to know that you're achieving that objective? You can use your staff survey data, or you can use usage data. And then tactics. What are you going to actually do differently to make sure that you're meeting the objectives? Is it something where you need to create new Teams channels or reorganize your file structure and so on? But I think that it's a good starting point for any digital workplace roadmap to kind of take a step back and discuss what are the things that you're trying to accomplish with it. The other piece that's kind of next in line typically is file storage standards. I've worked with a lot of organizations that have multiple cloud-based file storage systems in place. They might have SharePoint, they might have Dropbox, they might have Google Drive. And maybe that's redundant, or perhaps there is a reason for each of those systems. And maybe staff are just confused about where to save files. The file storage standards are really about clarifying the answer to those simple questions. And as you kind of move up your level of maturity, you might want to have some basic documentation for how your files should be organized at your organization. Is there a method to the madness, right? Sophisticated organizations are going to have more consistency at the subfolder level. Some organizations might have folders that are like Tom stuff. It's okay. There's no shame here. The key is that you want to create a map to give to new employees that they can use, and they don't start creating their own stuff folders out there. And you may even want to have some simple naming conventions. Do you prefix files with the date? Do you append draft when a file's in draft form? Or is, Tom's version of the plan okay? You want to keep the standards super simple. No one's going to read a 20-page document on file storage standards for your organization. The next piece that I usually emphasize is around internal communication and collaboration. A lot of organizations have internal communication and collaboration standards, but they're all unspoken norms. And so new staff don't know that they've made a mistake, in terms of breaking a norm until they do it. So for example, they post a message advertising Girl Scout cookie sales on the all staff Teams channel when it should have gone on the bulletin board channel, or the new staff person didn't know to join the WhatsApp group that's used for on-site convention communications. Or someone neglected to reply to an email in an unspoken amount of time because they didn't know that that was the expectation. Again, the goal here is all about simplicity. What are the official channels of your organization? When should you use those channels? What are your expectations? Sometimes just the process of listing the channels will identify that there's not clarity, or show you that there's redundancies, right? You might have multiple systems for chat, so you've got people that are using Teams chat, some people are using tech, or texting one another. You need to have a reason why each of those systems needs to exist. And then I would just emphasize, you don't want to forget about external stakeholders. Associations almost always have external folks that they need to work with. It might be board or committee members. It may be partner organizations, maybe consulting firms like Delcor or Altai. The last set of standards that I think is really important is related to working with people outside of your staff. In my view, the standards should really be similar in format to what you came up with internal communication and collaboration. You're essentially providing a menu of options that staff can use with the goal of discouraging staff from kind of ordering off menu and just finding some random system that's unsupported by your organization. And I would say with external collaboration, there may be some scenarios in which you can't dictate the platform for engagement. If the White House calls and says they want to work with you on a project, you're going to probably use whatever digital workplace platform they want to use. However, it's important to remind staff that if there is intellectual property that's created in collaborative projects, you want to make sure that you're saving those to systems that you have under your control. And your standards can really make that expectation clear. In my view, the digital workplace standards should be simple, and I always say your intended audience is you want to think about a staff person on their first day. You can hand them internal communication collaboration standards and immediately they know what are the channels that you use at your organization, as well as when to use those channels. So you don't have the kind of guessing game that's usual at most organizations. There are gentle reprimands when somebody posts something in the wrong place, or doesn't reply to an email in the correct amount of time. And then the other advantage, to keeping standards brief is that you need to update them, right? I encourage steering teams to reconvene on probably a quarterly basis just to address emerging issues, and at least once a year to make adjustments to the standards. That's what we do at Delcor with our own internal team, because the tools your business needs change, right? We all know that over the last couple of years. At some point in your career, you've probably come across a RACI chart, but I'll just explain this just really quickly. RACI basically stands for, R is for responsible, A is for accountable, who can make decisions related to something, C is consulted, whose input is sought on a decision, and I is informed, who is notified after a decision is made. One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that IT has obviously an important role to play in managing your digital workplace, but they probably aren't fully responsible for everything. So in this simple example, IT is responsible for many aspects of this organization's digital workplace. But as you can see, the education director oversees Zoom, which is used for webinars like the one we're in now. And the marketing director oversees Adobe Creative Cloud. Those systems are still important. You need to account for them, but staff need to be clear that IT doesn't oversee those critical systems. Another element to emphasize is that the digital workplace steering team should probably be consulted on all aspects of the digital workplace. So the standards that they're coming up with cover all of the platforms your organization uses. They should have the big picture in mind as part of their job. And then lastly, in the far right column, all staff should be informed when you're making decisions. You need to communicate the standards that the steering team develops, so everyone's aware of what the expectations and standards are. I have a lot of sympathy for IT teams today. I think all of us are completely dependent on technology to get our jobs done. But everyone expects IT to kind of teach them how to use all of these technology systems. And I'll frequently hear from staff that they want more training on the digital workplace tools that they use. And so I'll ask, what do you need training in? And they'll say SharePoint, or they'll say Teams. And for those of you who've used those platforms, you'll know that it's a really tall order to train people on the basics of those platforms, let alone every aspect of those tools. I've been using those tools for a long time, and there are new things that I learn on a pretty regular basis. So my point here is that it's really not reasonable to expect IT to train you on every aspect of your digital workplace platforms. Rather, what you want to do is come up with a brief list of competencies that you need to know at your organization to be a productive staff person. So just as an example here here are some sample competencies for using Microsoft Teams as a participant. And this is a fairly long list for this platform, just because, as I mentioned earlier, Teams is a pretty new platform. You're going to have probably new staff coming on board who may not have used that platform in their work life. However, your list, if you had a list for Outlook, it may be much shorter, right? You may expect incoming staff and new hires to kind of know the basics of using an email system like Outlook. And perhaps your only focus is on training staff how to use like the scheduling assistant or some advanced functionality within the Outlook platform. The main point is that you have a finite list of things that IT is trying to deliver training related to your digital workplace. You aren't boiling the ocean, so to speak, in the last slide. In a quick word on training, you may be tempted to sort of check the box of digital workplace training by simply pointing everyone to like a LinkedIn Learning subscription or something like that. And while that subscription may be part of your training plan, it shouldn't be the only component of your training plan. And that's not a knock on LinkedIn Learning. There's lots of great stuff there. You may have some industrious staff who are going to jump in and find all sorts of great training videos on that platform or any other like it. However, I would say inertia is a very powerful force. Staff are busy. They may not take the time to seek out training in whatever platform you offer. And also staff have different learning styles. On-demand training might not always work well for them. So my main point is that it's likely you'll need a plan that kind of combines different approaches, maybe some on-demand courses like from LinkedIn Learning, maybe some live instructor-led sessions, maybe some tips, and how-tos and that sort of thing, and documentation so that people can take a look at, learn things on their own schedule as well. All right, I want to close just by sharing a photo from last summer. This was the 4th of July, to be exact. My family was in the process of renovating our master bathroom, and an unlucky plumber stepped off one of the floor joists and he put his foot right through our living room ceiling. And so a few days later, I was in the dining room and I heard this big crash. And it turns out that our plumber's foot had really destabilized a lot of our living room ceiling, and it just like collapsed. And needless to say, we did not make it to the fireworks last year. It was also one time that I was really glad that we had a bunch of masks in our house. But my point in sharing this is that office workplace renovations, physical workplace renovations, just like home renovations, are really, really hard. They take a long time, permitting, all sorts of things like that. Digital workplace renovations, much easier, definitely much less dusty. So I would encourage all of you to get started or reach out if you need help. I appreciate you all listening, and I think we can now open it up for some questions from the audience, or if there's questions that you've gotten, Chris, through chat.
I'm going to go ahead and ask a question while we wait for anybody else to raise their hands. But from a high level, association workplaces have already sort of undergone a great deal of change over the last couple of years. What trends are you seeing from these changes with specific respect to associations and their digital workplaces?
Yeah, and I guess the biggest trend of late, and this may not be unique to associations, but that's who I work with primarily, is really around hybrid work. I think that a lot of organizations, as vaccination is much more prevalent, staff are feeling safer being in the physical workplace, whereas a year and a half ago they may not have. We're seeing staff that have kind of these hybrid workspaces, right? So they've got some staff that are in the office sometimes, some staff that are working remotely, and some blend of that. And I think that the challenge that I've kind of observed is it's balancing those needs is actually quite tricky in some ways. It's almost easier, right? If everyone's remote all the time, well, then it's sort of an even playing field. But if you've got some people in a meeting in person and you've got some people working remotely, how do you determine sort of what the playing field is that you're going to operate? And so I think it does require a little bit more creativity with your standard setting. Like when I go into the office, just like I am today, I often am just participating as if I were at my home office, right? It's just and that's fine. That may be the model that you end up deciding to do, is that, well, then you just need to make sure that your physical workspace has some places for staff to do that, and you need to make that expectation clear, that that's how most of our meetings are going to be virtual first, or whatever you want to call that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really poignant. It's a great answer. One of the other sort of things that really triggered me from the beginning was your sort of mentioning of this shadow IT. Maybe you could expound a little bit on how do you recognize the fact that your association may have a shadow IT, and what do you do to sort of combat that?
Yeah, I mean, when I do digital workplace work, I always really emphasize, this is a no shame project, right? And so shadow IT usually exists because there's a business need that's unfulfilled, or there's a lack of training, right? Maybe staff didn't know that they had a capability that was already available through the platforms that are official at your organization. So one of the things that I want to do at the beginning is say, let's get it all out there on the table. Everybody tell me the systems that you use to get work done. Inevitably, there will be one, maybe two, there's usually not a ton of surprise systems that the IT department is like, oh, I didn't know that you were using that project management tool or whatever it is, and it may not be causing problems. And the main thing is you want to bring that into the fold, right? You want to account for it because it is part of the employee, the staff person's daily work. It is part of your digital workplace. And you may identify, okay, hey, we have two systems that are redundant. Can we agree on one, so that we can work together more effectively? So I usually just say at the beginning, it's like, let's just get it all out there. We don't need to, this is a no shame zone. Let's put it all out on the table. And that's how I would approach it. And that's how I would encourage organizations to approach it. Let's not reprimand people, right, for implementing a system. Let's understand it, and then let's try and come together to an agreement on standards that will serve the organization best.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that really sort of showcases how this is a collaborative environment for these types of conversations, which sort of leads into my next kind of thought that I wanted to ask about was, you sort of touched a lot on really common digital workplace challenges. Can you think of or share any more unique challenges that you've seen specifically with associations?
I think probably what is probably somewhat unique to associations is related to collaboration with volunteers, committees, and boards. That's a use case that's is pretty consistent, is a consistent need with most association clients that I work with. And that volunteer collaboration experience is really critical to organization success. So if organizations are just, sending emails to committees and attaching files back and forth and so on, volunteers might get really frustrated. If they're used to a level of experience in their own workplace, and then it degrades when they're interacting with your organization, that's going to cause a lot of frustration. So what I really try and encourage the organization to do is aim first of all for consistency of experience. You don't want to be like a volunteers on this committee and that person uses Slack, and then I go over to this committee and they're using Microsoft Teams now. It's like, well, that's super confusing. So the first thing is figure out the scenarios, figure out the platform, and then really try and deliver a consistent experience. You're not going to get a perfect system that's probably going to make all of your volunteers happy all the time. But I think the worst case is if you have different experiences for every scenario. And so they're going to be really frustrated if they're like, I work with this group and it's different than the group that I worked with yesterday.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I've noticed we sort of mentioned at the top of the webinar that a lot of this sort of came out of our sort of joint experiences with joint clients. And they've been super passionate and interested in this and how it can really improve what they're doing. One of the things that I was hoping to pick your brain a little bit more on from that side of things is, what are some really common stumbling blocks or risks that associations run into once they've started to take on this digital workplace success journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of stumbling blocks is you have to have executive support. You need to have somebody in the C-suite who is sponsoring this effort, who sees the importance of the platforms that you're using and wants you to solve the challenges that you might be experiencing as an organization. Because I think if the leadership team isn't really, like if you come up with standards and the leadership team's not on board and they just kind of continue doing their own thing, that is a surefire way to undermine a governance project like a digital workplace roadmap. So I think that that's number one. I mean, I think the other thing that I kind of really push for when I do this work with clients is I try and make this a finite endeavor, right? We're not going to get to a state of perfection. There is no state of perfection where everything works all the time and we can all quit and go home.
Mm-hmm.
You're aiming for always trying to make it better. It's always that kind of continuous improvement model. And so what I always say is, let's get standards in place. Let's start somewhere. Let's put a stake in the ground. It may not be perfect, but then we can, we'll reconvene, like I said, once a quarter, once a year to kind of revisit these standards and make sure that they still apply. But I think that if you don't start somewhere, if you just kind of throw up your hands or you're trying to reach some state of perfection, you're going to be continuously frustrated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that what you just said there sort of reminded me of you mentioned several points. The idea of keeping your documentation simple or keeping the file naming convention simple so that it's easy to follow. And that really, I think, spoke to me as far as things we've done within our own organization and conversations we've had with associations at large. So I think that all sort of pins it all together. I think that's sort of a great cap on what you've discussed here and how that all sort of pieces together.
Awesome.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, and we've still got a little bit of time if anybody else comes up with anything, but I think this has been fantastic and really want to thank you for being here and speaking with us on this. And if you haven't noticed, Tom has his contact information up on screen. We'll also send that out as a follow-up email along with this recording in case you missed any aspect of the presentation in general. But if this is something you or your organization are interested in learning more about, reach out to Tom, reach out to us here at Altai, and we're happy to have further conversations really specifically around your association and how you can really implement this into your day-to-day. So again, thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Take care.